of you know call and response. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes, thank you. Welcome to the Gaithersburg Book Festival. My name is Tanisha Briley, and I am proud to serve as the city manager of this great city. Oh, that's for Gaithersburg, yes. I am thrilled to introduce two brilliant first-time novelists whose books explore the historical Black experience in rich and unexpected ways. Nyani Nkrumah, author of Wade in the Water, was born in Boston and raised in Accra, Ghana, and Harare, Zimbabwe. She developed her love of reading and writing from her mother, who taught English, literature, and language, and encouraged her children to recite poems and Shakespeare soliloquies. After graduating from Amherst College with a dual major in biology and Black studies, Nyani received her master's at the University of Michigan. I'm an Ohio State Buckeye. It gets stuck in my throat. Ugh, I'm gonna work through it. Jamila apparently went there too. We'll make it. We're gonna make it, everybody. Okay. So she received her master's at University of Michigan and a PhD from Cornell University. She lives in Washington, D.C. area with her family and works in international development. Nyani set out to present a story that was tense, suspenseful, and gave the reader a really great experience. And I can personally vouch that Wade in the Water does just that. Jamila Minnick is the author of Moonrise over New Jessup, her debut novel that earned her the 2021 winner of the PEN Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction. Established by Barbara Kingsolver in 2000, it is awarded biennially to the author of a previously unpublished novel of high literary caliber that exemplifies the prize's founding principles: fiction that addresses issues of social justice and the impact of culture and politics on human relationships. Jamila's work is also published in Craft Literary Magazine, The Right Launch, and The Silent World in Her Face. Her piece, Politics of Distraction, was nominated for the Pushcart Prize. A lawyer turned writer, or lioness telling tales, as she describes herself, Jamila is also a graduate of the University of Michigan.
Go Blue! Go Blue!
And the Howard University School of Law in Georgetown University.
HU! I'm listening. HU!
Oh.
There we go.
She lives in Washington, D.C. Jamila describes Moon over New Jessup as her love letter to the elders and ancestors who for generations strove to make a way out of no way for themselves and future generations. I'm looking forward to hearing more from them both today, and I know all of you are as well. I would also like to present to you Melanie Hatter, who will be moderating today's panel. Melanie is also an author, and I didn't write it down, Melanie. Tell me the name of the book again.
Malawi Sisters.
Malawi Sisters, published in 2019.
Yep, from Four Way Books.
Please buy Melanie's book as well. I'm going to turn it over to Melanie, and thank you all for being here. Don't forget to buy lots and lots of books.
Welcome. What a wonderful crowd. I am beside myself excited to be here talking with these two phenomenal writers. If you haven't gotten their books, you seriously need to go immediately after this session and purchase them. There are so many aspects to this, so many directions that I wanted to take in our discussion, and I really wish so much that we had like 2 hours, because I feel like I could have talked forever and ever about these amazing books. So you get a taste. I'm going to invite both of them to read a little bit from their works. Let's start with Jamila.
So I'm just going to start at the beginning. I'm going to sort of shave off the very beginning, but I'll give you all about 5 minutes, if that's all right, of Alice Young as she arrives in New Jessup, Alabama. So, all right. So, in eternity, the time had come for me to leave the home where I was born. The sun was setting, and the half-balled red sweet gum around the fields announced November, just a few days coming. But 1957 was still October old when my landlord ended up face down on the ground for trying to drag me behind him to the tool shed. My my daddy had passed a couple weeks before, and I had settled him next to Mama, though their burial left me scrambling for the rent. My sister Rosie was living in Chicago with a nice family and doing hair, and my need to keep a roof over my head had mellowed my worry into wonder about when her next letter would arrive. There was plenty of gleaning left to make November's payment, and then I'd scratch around for whatever came available to buy myself some time. I had never planned or wanted to leave Alabama, but with old man Todd shouting curses at my back, his face split open, gushing sweet gum red, my plans to stay began to fade. After a night at the neighbors and an hours-long walk with the dawn, I arrived at the bus station with just my thrown-together knapsack. The man behind the counter told me that my little money would carry me to Birmingham, not Nashville or Louisville or Cleveland, let alone Chicago. Birmingham, he said, and no further. In the hours that I waited on the bus to depart, my world came undone piece by piece. Unable to get someplace I never wanted to go, with ticket in hand to a place I knew not a single soul, first, the landscape flattened. Direction was next, north, south, east, west, all headed towards the unfamiliar. And then finally color, till everything faded to black and white. I rode the bus into this flat, directionless, colorless world until it shushed to a stop in my new home. Not that I knew it at the time. No, my ticket read Birmingham, and all I knew was that we had stopped somewhere between nowhere in particular and the big city. We had gone 100 country miles, or maybe 10, stopped once, twice, I don't know. I was huddled against the window watching the world blur by, while the man seated next to me kept up a one-sided conversation about returning north after visiting with his wife and children down country. Somewhere along the way, he started worrying me about the brown paper bag in my lap and the chicken grease soaking through to my dress, but that oily stain hardly ruined anything. The gray threads had known color when I first sewed them, red plaid, but that stain just turned light gray to ash and ash gray to black, so somewhere near Needham, I offered him the chicken. He took it and finally left me alone. The bus shushed to a stop and it emptied, some getting off, hugging loved ones hello, some taking luggage from the belly of the bus, most everybody stretching, smiling, and laughing underneath the blue sky day. But the stops were all the same to me, so I stayed inside the bus with my head against the glass, feeling the sun's warmth on the window. And that's when a red-heeled shoe clicked its way up the sidewalk. 2 of them, if I'm honest, though it wasn't so much the shoes that caught my eye, but the bronze stocking legs inside them. They continued up the way towards the sidewalk cafe before disappearing through the front door. And I'll stop there.
Ooh, that's quite the teaser. Nyani.
Okay, so I'm going to actually read from the middle of the book. And the story is about a 12-year-old girl, Ella. And she's living this very complicated life in Mississippi in a rural town. And then one day walks in Catherine St. James, and she is a white researcher from Princeton. So the point that I'm going to read to you is Ella talking. This is a first-person point of view narrative. So Ella is the key person, but I also use a number of multiple perspectives in the book. So I'm actually just going to read you this section. This is when Catherine St. James comes into town. Leaving Nate's an hour later, I spotted her coming out of the Ricksville Library. This is Ella talking. She's seen Catherine St. James come out of the Ricksville Library, her right arm clutching about 6 heavy books. Mr. Wilkinson's hardware store was just a few doors away, and as usual, he was standing in the doorway, giving black folk that dirty look that kept them stepping right past his store and to the bus stop that would take them 10 minutes away to the other hardware store, the one that didn't mind who came in so long as the money they were holding was green. I watched him tripping over himself to get at Miss St. James. I didn't think she was that pretty, but you would have thought she was the most beautiful woman on earth the way he carried on. He pulled those books out of her hands before she had even time to say hello, and before I could wonder what he was doing, he had turned back into his store, and within seconds he was out again, her library books now sticking out of a nice white carrier bag. Miss St. James put out her hand and touched his shoulder, and then he was a-talking, smiling, and laughing. We'd never seen him so much as show his teeth before. He was all ready to walk her home, too. I could tell by the way he took the keys out of his pocket and locked the store door. But then she stopped him and pointed south, past Main Street. That was the black side south, where she was living. He shook his head and pointed north, as though she was confused. I know what he was thinking. This is just another lady with no sense of direction. But she shook her head slowly and pointed south again. Mr. Wilkinson sure stopped smiling then. He now took her arm, almost twisting it, and unlocked that store door, opened it, and pulled her inside and shut the door. I waited to see what would happen. After 15 minutes or so, she was out again, and she looked mad. I could tell because she stepped right into Main Street without looking left or right to check for cars, and she crossed the street real fast. She'd already been walking fast on her way to the library, and now she was almost running. I had to run to keep up. On Ricksville Road, 4 men passed by on the other side of the street. If she was black, they would have crossed over and quickly said, "Let me get that bag for you," even if it meant them walking 10 minutes back in the other direction. Or they may have said, "Whoa, girl, slow down. What you walking so fast for? These ain't slavery days." They didn't so much as glance at her, but I knew they saw her, watched her with the pupils of their eyes slid all the way to the side, stopping right at the corners, all the while thinking the same thing everyone was. What is that woman doing here? Just isn't right. Seemed to me Miss St. James' arrival was just stirring the pot, unsticking all those things we wanted left stuck at the bottom of the pot. That night, after I said my prayers and prayed for Mr. Maccabee and Nate and everyone in the house, I added Miss St. James to the list. I wasn't sure why I did it, but I thought of her all alone in that house, the only white woman for miles, surrounded by a sea of black people. Nice people for the most part, but she wouldn't know that. And now I knew she was scared of us, just as scared of us as we were of her.
Both of you have written really multi-layered, fascinating lead characters. And I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about where the inspiration for these characters came from, particularly, these sort of very strong female characters that you've written. Nyani, you have both a young girl, Ella, who is black, but then you have the white perspective of Miss St. James, and then Jamila, Alice Young, who, sort of really is, you sort of introduced her coming away. She's on this bus and she, comes into this sort of new world in a sense, but it's also a world that she's becomes very comfortable with. Talk a little bit, let's start with you, Nyani, just about where these characters came from and, just who they are and sort of what they represent to you.
Okay. Sure, happy to tell you. I would say Ella is the 12-year-old in my book, and she is precocious, and she's living, as I said, this complicated life where Her family literally hates her. Her mother hates her. You'll learn why. And her father, stepfather, can't stand to look at her. Now, in terms of where it came from, I mean, it took me 6 years to write this book. And so Ella is as familiar to me as one of my children. And her character I developed over time. I would say the story comes from really growing up as a child in West Africa. I lived I had two different types of, I would call, lives. When I grew up in Ghana, it was a very colorblind society. In Ghana, most people are obviously dark-skinned African, but my parents lived a very diplomatic life. So we had a lot of people, usually from Europe, coming in and out of our house. And I went to an international school, and in that school was every color of the rainbow. And what I learned in that school was that, I mean, we come from different places, but we are all people. We are all as academically bright. There's complete great disclosure in Ghana, so you do have the knowledge that everyone is as bright as everybody else. But then when I was 15, my parents moved to Zimbabwe, which is a country which is kind of like South Africa. You know, South Africa went through apartheid. And at the time, Zimbabwe was just coming out of that same system where race meant everything and color meant absolutely everything. So in fact, from the shade of the color that you were meant something. What people perceived of you meant something. And so having these two diametrically opposed, basically, backgrounds, it made me reflect a lot on basically the legacy of our families and generational legacy. Where does racism come from? Where does colorism come from? So when I was writing the novel, I was writing on two different levels. So on one level, you have this story of Ella and Catherine St. James, and it's their friendship, and it's intricate, and their highs and lows in the friendship. But on this deeper level of the story, you have this issue of examining racism and classism and colorism. And so you get to know the characters very well. And most readers are going to look at the characters and say, especially for Catherine St. James, we want to know more about her. Like, where does she come from? How are her beliefs represented in the book? And so that's the mystery that surrounds Miss St. James. And the book takes you a deep dive into the characters of the two.
Yeah, you definitely get to know both of them very, very well. And Miss St. James is quite, you've written her exceptionally well because you use a third person point of view. So you're in her head, but you're not so close that you're, so yeah, you really get a very interesting perspective in terms of her background and how Ella gets to know her and discovers things about her that we're not going to talk about. Jamila.
So the inspiration for Alice and Njasa really comes from my family. I mean, it was really important to me to represent Black people who love the South. And, my people are Alabama. We've been Alabama since well before emancipation, and y'all know what that means. But my family at emancipation decided to stay in Alabama for 4 generations. I was the first one born outside of the state. And so whenever I hear people call Alabama in particular, but certainly anybody who's got people from Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Texas, whenever I say my people are Alabama, I used to see people sort of groan or, say, well, it's always better. Things are better for you up north. And I love my cousin who is from Bessemer, Alabama, who says they're different. But so Alice really represents the women in my family. I gave her the name Alice Young because that was my mama's maiden name. And in fact, when my Aunt Clara, who's my mama's last living sibling, read New Jessup, she said, "You sure Alice ain't kin to us?" I said, "Well, she is you, Aunt Clara. She's very much you, but, but it was very important to me to represent the fullness of our communities when we are in community with one another. And I think, getting into the writing process sort of further along, I was, I wasn't so interested in sort of the expectation that I'm writing about racial tension and chaos in the way that I think is expected in black literature to say, well, the white people come in and ruin everything, because I had the same 100,000 words, same page limit as everybody else. And I felt like in these communities, and communities like New Jessup absolutely existed and still exist, and they could have been a couple of city blocks, they could have been fully incorporated municipalities, but they ran the gamut. We had 1,200 of these communities in the United States. And so I wanted to write a book that honored my family. I wanted to write a book about black people being in community with one another in the full breadth of what that looks like. And I just wanted to tell a story also of a woman like Alice, who, once she gets involved with Raymond and sort of this tension with this organization that comes into town, I wanted Alice's story to be the central story, because we always get the Raymond stories. We get the other people in the book who maybe have a little more flash and sizzle, but Alice was a young woman once, and it's called Moonrise over New Jessup because Alice is so integral. Today the young people say everybody eats, but Alice literally made sure not only that everybody eats, but she was a crucial and central member of her community. She loved the people in her community, but she also had tension and strife. And, you see all of that in the book operating within a black people. Like I think Lene O'Neill said, she said, at the heart of it, New Jessup is a book about black people minding our own black business. And then you get to see what that looks like when we're just in community with one another.
What I found really fascinating about both of these books was this sense of black communities, sort of safe black spaces. Because you have in Moonrise over New Jessup, you have Jessup, which is sort of the white side of town, and then you have New Jessup, which is the black side of town, and they really want to be their own community. They don't want, to be desegregated. They kind of like the being segregated. And then in Wade in the Water, it's set in the 80s, and just because of the way things are in this nation, Ella is living in a community that is segregated. Even in the 80s, and probably even today, we have a lot of communities that are still very separate. But what I found really interesting was this idea of, do we need these black spaces that are safe for black communities? Looking at some of the headlines that are happening today, were you thinking about, the Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Rosewood, Florida, those black communities that were thriving that became targets and ended up being destroyed? But then we have Eatonville, right, which is still a very much black community that's here today. Were you thinking about those kinds of communities as you were writing? Yeah.
Well, I absolutely, I will say that Eatonville, Hobson City, Alabama. So if there's anybody here from Alabama, Hobson City is the first black municipality in Alabama. It will be 125 years old in 2024. What I will say, and I just want to, this is just a point of clarification. So when we say that people wanted to be segregated, I would never take that to my elders, because my elders will tell you quick, fast, we did not want a system of laws that made sure that we couldn't walk here, eat there, go here, worship here, swim in the swimming pool. Segregation really operated to create a second-class citizenship.
Right.
So what you'll hear from my elders is that we wanted independence, that we were self-reliant, that we did for ourselves, that we needed our own, that we knew that the resources that were supposed to come to our schools and everything were being diverted. So it's when that's my stump speech. So if anybody walks away from here with nothing else, I just hope that we sort of understand that a community like Eatonville was founded on the premise of self-reliance.
Absolutely.
But that being said, absolutely, Eatonville, Hobson City, Tulsa, and it's really. Sometimes people come and they say, ask me what I feel about writing about the margins of society, and when we talk about black safe spaces, you'll see if you read New Jessup has not only schools and churches, as many of these communities did, it also had a hotel, hospital, savings and loans, candy stores. It had all the things that you would have found in a Tulsa, all the things that you would find probably in Gaithersburg, right? And so to say that a place like New Jessup could be considered a margin of society as opposed to society, it sort of makes you wonder, how does one define the margins and how does one define society, right? But so when we have these conversations about safe spaces, I think we just need to be able to normalize the idea that black people deserve to live in communities and have loving communities that thrive. I mean, the fact that we are still in 2023 having conversations about black safe spaces, like that's the anomaly, when these communities absolutely existed, is sort of, it's something I think that it causes us, at least it forces me to sort of question those assumptions.
Interesting.
Okay, I was going to say we don't have quite the same thing in Wade in the Water, because really it takes place in a fictitious town, most of it, which is Ricksville. And I did model it on the South and Mississippi, having gone down there and spent some time. I did a lot of research, which was interesting. You realize that, and you can do a lot of research on Google, and you can do Google Maps, and you can see the spaces. What you realize, at least in the area that I was choosing, was that over the last, let's say, 40, 50, 60 years, not much has changed in the rural space. So some of the towns, if you look at Google Maps and you got pictures from the 1960s and you look at the pictures today, you're realizing there's not a lot of, of change as there are in the urban settings. And I modeled it on what we see across America. Even I live in Washington, D.C., I live in Chevy Chase. If you look at it, you can see it's not a deliberate segregation, because obviously people can move in there if they're not, but because of many different factors, you do have whites to the north and blacks to the south, and that's, you can see that in many cities across America, many neighborhoods. So the model in this story was that Ella was living in Ricksville, in the southern part of Ricksville, which was a very tight-knit black community. And you get to learn the people in the community who live there with her. I mean, there are a host of characters and her interaction with each of them. And then you have Catherine St. James, who supposedly comes from the north, from Princeton, obviously an Ivy League, prestigious, beautiful campus, by the way, and moves into Ricksville to do her research. And that sets off this whole dichotomy, because why is she coming there and what does she want? And she's studying actually civil rights, and she's studying what happens in the South from the 1940s onwards. And so part of it is, the way I set up the book is that the children in the community are very attracted to Catherine St. James. She's new, she's different, but at the same time, they're a little wary. The adults in the neighborhood, on the other hand, are very suspicious. And why are they suspicious? Because of the weight of what has happened in the 1960s. Obviously, they still remember, this is Mississippi we're talking about. They still remember the past. And within the novel, it's partly a historical novel in the sense that there's a story within the story, which is a true story that comes from, some murders that happened in Mississippi back in the 1960s. So just basically setting up the stage of how I introduce the characters.
I'm curious, what comes first? Is it sort of that bigger idea for the story, or is it the characters, and the characters kind of lead you to the bigger story?
Yeah.
I guess, yeah,
Oh,
go ahead.
I mean,
Oh.
whichever.
Well, for me, New Jessup started as a short story, and it really was. I had this sort of vision in my head of this black family sitting around a holiday table debating the merits of Brown versus the Board of Education. My family, they're all educators, and so in Alabama, and so the teachers and the principals in my family had a very specific view of it about what would happen to them, their jobs, the children in their schools, um, once integration hit. So I sat down to write this story about this, and it was going to be a holiday table, and you know how we all get at the holidays. So, I took this snapshot in my mind of sort of Percy sort of pointing an accusing finger at Raymond, and Pop just sort of sitting back, letting his boys argue, and Alice was standing at the edge of the table with a turkey. And in this vision, if it's just a snapshot, I thought about all the photos I've looked at over the years of the people in my family, and we can all name Percy and say what he was saying, and they could all name Pop and what he was doing. But when it came to pointing to Alice and saying, well, who is this with the turkey? People will remember that turkey was dry, and they'll remember the cranberry sauce was runny, and they'll remember that somebody put raisins in the potato salad, but they won't remember her name. And so I said, that was the moment, and the women in my family have a very specific, I call it an Alabama smile. And she sort of looked in that snapshot. She was like, they know my mind on this, and I don't have to say a word. But what happens is, as the generations go by, Alice, her name, and her thoughts on the matter get lost. And so that's when I knew it was her story, and then I built it out from there.
Okay. I'm one of these writers that you call fly by the seat of your pants, in the sense that I have absolutely no idea where I'm going. I just start, and my main figure, of course, was Ella, this 11, 12-year-old girl, and just getting inside her head. She's the one that tells the story, so I'm really developing her story, and then all of a sudden, I start to think about Catherine St. James. And the interesting thing that happened for me was I wrote almost the entire novel with Catherine St. James coming in the middle of the story. And I sent it around, and my agent and my readers kept saying to me, well, we don't understand Catherine St. James. We know she appears, and Ella and her have this relationship, but who is she, and what are her motivations? And what you realize is that after I had all this feedback, I went back and I started writing basically Catherine St. James' story. And to get a really full understanding of who she was, I decided to go back into her childhood. So the way the book is written, you're going to see two stories. So you're going to see Ella's story as a child, and then you're actually going to see Catherine St. James' story. So you also get a very deep understanding of where she's coming from. And it starts in the 1950s. She's a 5-year-old girl, and there's snapshots of her life up until the point that she meets Ella and begins this relationship with her. And all of this, came chapter by chapter, so none of it was planned. But what I do is, it's in the editing that I carve out the story. So I write, and then I go back, and I have this excruciating process of editing where I write, and then I read and reread, and it might take me 1 month or 2 months on a chapter. Sometimes it might take me 6 months on a chapter, and I'm just changing a word here, a phrase here, and from that is where I carve out the story.
You are not alone. I can totally relate to that. So we're down to about maybe 13 minutes or so, and I do want folks in the audience to have an opportunity to ask questions. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand and speak up. We are being recorded. Do we have any questions?
ma'am.
For sign, you're asking about signing afterwards? Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to go and see if I can sort of squeeze in on that, but but our panel is scheduled. These two for sure, and I'm just going to hover around because they do have my books over there. So
nice.
yes, I see a hand in the back there.
Thank you.
That's it. Oh, thank you. He said he loved the speech and he loved the story. So
you.
thank you so much for
Thank
that.
you.
Question.
Yes, ma'am.
Your started as a short story. Did you have ideas in your head to come up with this and think, I have stories now, I write a novel? Did you write short stories and essays before this?
She's asking sort of how these stories came to be, where they, one, we learned started as a short story, but sort of what else was the process?
Well, I will say that it was a short story in my mind for about 10 minutes because I knew early on that Alice deserved an entire novel. And then it just came to me. I mean, some of the story just really flowed for me. So I'm a chronological writer, but you'll see that New Jessup is a lot of times a braided narrative, so you get these vignettes into the history. But the way that it's written is the way that I came up hearing stories told to me as a child. So that's why you get Alice. Like, I wanted Alice to be rendered fully and completely on the page so that, those of us who came up with an Alice as a big mama or grandmama or whomever will see her as a young woman. Because I think sometimes when we're particularly young people who read my book, and then they come and they say, this is so great, and they're identifying with Alice, and I say, Alice is probably the same age as your big mama, which means your big mama was young once. And then they sort of look at me like, what? But yeah, so this was about a short story for about 10 minutes.
Let me just quickly answer that. For me, I can't say that I just started it out as a book. I intended to write a book. It took 6 years because I have a full-time job. So whenever I could get the opportunity, I look at it like knitting. You take it up, you write, and then you put it down when, stuff happens. So my family has lived with this book for a very long time.
Nope.
Okay.
I would just like to follow up on that. Were you writers as children? I mean, what did you do as a child that brought you to this level now as a published author?
Oh,
She's
okay.
asking, sorry.
Oh, I see.
She's asking, were they writers as children, and sort of what was going on in their childhood that brought them to the writing world?
Well, for me, it's easy. My mother, as I said, was a literature and language teacher, phenomenal teacher. She's the type of Shakespeare teacher that would, for Romeo and Juliet, she would jump on the desk. And, people absolutely loved her. And so I think I wrote my first short story for her. Maybe I was about 6, and I stapled it together. And then I also wrote a very short, it's about 40-page children's adventure book when I was probably about 19. So this was my big novel.
So like I said, I grew up with storytellers. So as a child, I was a tale teller, which at some point my family said, if you're going to tell these stories, I used to want to jump in with all the adults and be interesting. And so I would say, I just watched some movie about, maybe it was Top Gun or something, and I said, there's a man named General Whitaker, and he comes and he gets me, and I fly in F-16s. And my family would sort of look at me, and they'd be like, okay. But, so I grew up with this really incredible imagination, and then I had access to just these real storytellers. And so as I got a little older, I started writing these things down, but it was really helpful because I felt like from early on, like when I was knee high to a cricket, I was learning my voice, right? And so it felt like a very natural progression to write.
I feel like I saw a hand back here. Yep, go ahead.
I had a question for Jamila. How do you extract from these like real people who are characters into like turning these folks into fictional characters for a story to serve a different purpose than like who they are as your family?
That's
So, yeah, extracting from real life characters.
you know, I started with wanting to honor the essence of who they are. And, some of the anecdotes in the book, my family read it, they recognize some of the conversations or the anecdotes or whatever, but it was really for me capturing the essence of people I know or people I know are in my family but who I'd never met, and finding ways to, put that in different people. Like Pop and Mr. Marvin are of a certain generation in my book, right? They both take characteristics from my Uncle John. And so it was really, once I have such a rich background to draw from, so it's almost like the people in my family are too big to be limited to one character. And I call my people in my book people because to me they represent people I know or don't know. But it really felt like they were just too big to be sort of hemmed into like a Mr. Marvin or Pop or Alice. And Alice is literally the representation of all the women in my family. That's why my Aunt Clara sort of smiles when she's like, I know that story. And I'm like, well, don't tell anybody. That's a great question.
Nyani, what about you? The Catherine St. James and Ella, did you have sort of real life people who influenced them?
A lot of people ask that question. And actually, no. I think one of the questions that I've gotten is how do you write about somebody that's other than you, like a white person? How do you write about a white person? And I said, well, I don't really see it as a white person. It's the person and who she is intrinsically. And to be able to get into her personality and her character, I have to understand who she is. And I did that by going into her childhood, seeing the influences of her family and how much her family, especially her father, she grew up very, very close to her father. And she wanted to be just the same as her father. She wanted to walk like him. She wanted to talk like him. And a lot of the stories, how do we break free of the things that bind us in our families? And so that's where it came from.
Yeah, her father is quite the character. Were they related? Which story? Were they related in Nyani, the Catherine St. James and Ella? Yeah. Are they related? They're not related.
No, they're not. They're not related at all.
I see another question here.
The
Can you-
question is, how did my family react to the book? I can tell you unequivocally they love it, And I'll tell you, it's not just because they recognize ancestors who I don't know or, people who they see themselves, but it's also because they get really tired of Alabama being a single narrative. So my family very much still loves Alabama. I was taught that Alabama is not, like when people call Alabama and they sort of grit their teeth, they're not thinking about the fact that my family hunted on that land, grew food on that land, owned businesses on that land. We owned land. We had schools. We went to church on that land. We very much love that land. So when people call Alabama like that, they're calling the sin in the hearts of man as the problem, which my family very much fights against, right? But we very much love the soil. So my Auntie Jay always says, when we found out that the book was going to be published, like the actual pub date, we had sort of this family Zoom, and everybody was really excited. And she said, you better keep telling those people that Alabama is more than the Civil War and civil rights. And all I can say is, yes, ma'am. So that's what I'm here to do.
I love it. I think we might have time for one more question. If there is.
Nobody? Don't be shy.
No? So everyone's lining up to go buy the books? Yeah? Okay. Are we about, yeah, let's see. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about the setting. Jamila's talked a lot about Alabama, and we were talking earlier, and it really kind of it was such an interesting perspective because I've never been to Alabama, and I just hear the rhetoric, and actually reading a story that's talking about the earth and the people was very eye-opening for me. What about the setting for you? It seems like it was particularly important for this particular story.
Yeah. Well, the setting, a number of people come to me and say the imagery was very real. And part of the reason is I drew on my experience. I'm an environmental specialist in my real life and a natural resource specialist. So what was important to me was really showing the soil. You hear a lot about the red earth. You hear about the types of trees that are grown in Mississippi. In the particular area that I placed the novel, I went and visited. And you can even see in the houses, the house that Ella grew up, it's a very small, peeling paint house. All the houses and the construction and the way I placed the town is all from, something that I actually saw. And so that sense of place, you'll get a sense of the rural nature of Mississippi. You'll get a sense of the earth. You'll get a sense of the warmth of the people, and that's what I wanted to convey as I wrote this, the book and the setting.
Yep. Like I say, these two stories were just absolutely riveting to me. I read them very, very quickly, and they ask a lot of really deep questions about identity, about our space, about the legacy of slavery and racism, and how that's really affected the communities that are struggling in many ways. But I absolutely highly encourage you to buy these books, and thank you so much, Jamila,
Thank you.
Nyani, for
Thank you.
spending this
Thank
time.
you all. It's a pleasure to be here.